last time we saw each other was in New Zealand,
That's
where
right.
Stephen was traveling with the New Zealand Symphony Orchestra and was kind enough to give me his flowers at the end of his concert where he was playing Sanson. I don't know which number, I don't remember which one, but
I
it
think
gave
it
me a
might have
lot
been
of,
wonderful, but they're all wonderful. So
they're all wonderful. And many people don't know, but you're a citizen of Australia. Your father was born in Australia.
that's right. Well, my father was born there, so it's one of those accidental things. He was only there for a few months, but it was enough to give me the possibility of citizenship, and I love that part of the world. And so I filled out a form, I sent in a check for £50, and a passport came back in the post. So it's one of the best investments I think I've ever made in my life.
I actually heard you perform in the famous Sydney Opera House, which you talk about reverently in Rough Ideas, as one of these institutions which you finally see is as incredible as when you imagine it. However, it has some of the worst acoustics in the world, doesn't it?
Yes, well, I wouldn't go that far. I think that the acoustics perhaps don't match the building itself. The building itself is like something alive, it's like one of
Mm-hmm.
the greatest structures I think that we've ever built as human beings. Unfortunately, when you sit in a seat and the music starts playing, it depends where you're sitting, but it's not the best. But they're closing it and revamping it, and so I reckon in about 2 or 3 years, it may have the best acoustics in the world. So
That's right.
another good reason to go and visit Australia.
Exactly. Like the Elves Philharmonic, which nobody can go into because the acoustics. Have you played there?
I haven't, no.
I heard the acoustics are really extraordinary.
Yeah. Well, we've got some wonderful halls now. Many in the world. The new hall in Paris has these wonderful ratings. So it's great. We're entering into a new era, I think, of great acoustics and because I think in the 50s, 60s, the early version of Avery Fisher Hall, other places, the Festival Hall in London in its first incarnation, disappointing. But now I think we're learning from the past and looking to the future.
One of the essays in Rough Ideas, I'm going to go back forwards before I go backwards, is you talk a lot about Wigmore Hall.
Yeah.
Which is really, it's basically a recital hall. How many seats are in Wigmore? Maybe 500?
400, something like that, yeah.
But it's been an amazing institution, and it's a profound place to play. It's really extraordinary.
It has an incredible history. I mean, almost everyone that you can think of made their debut there and indeed came back there. Rubinstein gave his last recital at Wigmore Hall. It's right in the middle of London. It has a very faithful audience and there's an incredible success story today. It's very often sold out and a wonderful, wonderful, intimate place to play.
And I think that the seats are affordable. That's one thing I knew when I lived in London, is that it was still really affordable, unless you wanted to go to the opera, to go hear classical music in London. Is that still the case?
A lot of options, I think, there. A lot of good deals, especially for young people. I think Wigmore have something like a £2 a seat deal for the under 30s or something like that. So, yeah, and not the crazy, crazy high prices that you can get in some cities. So it's pretty good. And of course, well, the great thing in London is the museums, which are all free.
For free, that's right.
You
Like
can
in
go
Washington, D.C. as well.
and see some of the greatest paintings in the world on your way to work, or you could do before we were all locked away in our homes.
So let's go into the present. So what is it like in London? And is this the longest you've ever been in one place in your adult concertizing life?
I think it is, Cheryl, actually. London's lovely at the moment as far as the weather. We've had the most gorgeous spring weather for the last few weeks. Not so much traffic. I don't hear planes overhead. Of course, everything that's nice about it is shadowed, isn't it, by the knowledge that, that people are very sick. People are losing their jobs. Beautiful shops that have been there for centuries may never open again. So that side of it, of course, is very melancholy and very disturbing. And also the fact that we can't see our friends. I was talking to a neighbor of mine who lives literally a 10-minute walk away. I would love to go. She said, come over and have a glass. Oh, we can't do that anymore. I can't go and sit in her garden and have a glass of wine. We might be able to do it at a distance or something like that. But it's very sad that, because I think the difference, of course, with this virus is that in the past, of course, we've been through terrible things as human beings, through plagues and through wars and everything else. But we've always been able to gather together and support each other. And I think even at the worst time of AIDS, there was a time when people didn't know how you caught it, and so there was nervousness. But once we realized you couldn't catch it just by being close to someone, we all gathered around our friends who were suffering, and we were able to hold someone's hand in hospital, to give them a big hug, you know, when they were just a bag of bones. And now we can't do that. That's the one thing, we can't comfort each other. So that's what makes this particularly distressing. And also the fact that it's invisible, and we can't, if we're not sick ourselves, we think to ourselves, well, why am I at home? Why can't I go out and do the things I used to do? So it's a time of patience and a time of readjustment in many ways.
So I'm going to ask you, what has your month of April been like, and what would it have been like if you were concertizing?
Well, I would have been in New York right now. I think this event was actually taking place today, wasn't it?
Right.
Last week, I would have been in Washington, D.C. with the National Symphony. I was due to go to Dallas to play with the Dallas Symphony. I had recitals as well. I had my students at Juilliard to teach. All of this, of course, cancelled. I went through my iPhone just pressing that delete button, delete, delete, delete for the whole month, and I was left with this white page. And here I am in London. It's actually been quite good in some ways, because I realized that I've been traveling and playing and worrying for 35 years, non-stop. I wake up in the morning, what have I got to do today? Oh, I have to get to the airport. Where's my passport? You know, what visa do I need to have stamped in for this? And all of that is that concerto memorized. And now I get up in the morning and I calmly go and work on my own. And I've had a lot of composition things to do. And it's been amazing, because for the first time in my life, I could actually compose all day long without thinking, you shouldn't be doing this. You should be practicing that Chopin. You should be doing this. So that side of it has actually been quite positive for me so far this month, the time to be really absorbed in what I'm doing.
Since we're talking about the pandemic, I'll ask this question, which I was going to leave for later, which is, there was an essay on NPR's site about pandemic classical music compositions. The first one was by, let me see, was during the Black Plague. And then the second one was Bach. I mean, Bach was orphaned by the time he was 10 and lost 10 of his 20 children, and then wrote a cantata after this plague in Marseille, where 100,000 people were killed. But the one which I knew and which we talked about before we went on air was John Crigliano's Symphony No. 1, which is known as the AIDS Symphony, which is, I was in the audience and you could literally hear half of what was then Avery Fisher, now David Kiffin, sobbing. And I was wondering, A, about your involvement with that composition, and whether you think that the pandemic is going to bleed into your own work, or will there be sort of an explosion of pandemic classical music when we finally get out of here, out of our little bubbles?
Well, I think there are a number of points there, obviously. I think the principal thing, though, with John's symphony is that AIDS was not the same as COVID-19. You know, AIDS was something that was all about outsiders and insiders. It was about, like the plague, in the sense that these were gay people, were the untouchables. It was the great excuse that people who'd ostracized gay people, and it was their great excuse to say, well, look at what these people, you know, they deserve it. You know, this awful thing about it, God's plague, God's answer to homosexuality and so on. So that whole side of it, which John's piece came out of, is not there today. We're all equally vulnerable to this. And so you can't blame anybody for this. And that, in a way, that's a good thing, of course. Mm-hmm. So John's Symphony, yeah, I got a call from John one day. I was in my apartment in New York, and he said, Stephen, do you have a score of the Albéniz Godowsky tango? He said, I can't tell you what I want it for, but I wonder if you have it. This is the days before computers and internet searches and things, and I did have it. So I gave it to him, and he made a copy. And then it turned up in his first symphony as this sort of incredible nostalgic thing with an offstage piano. It shows up near the beginning in the first movement, and then right at the end of the piece it comes back. And it's a sort of symbol of the good things in the past that were no longer there because people were dying. And this piece was written, or John began it he had a commission from the Chicago Symphony. He began it after hearing that his friend Sheldon Skolnick had been diagnosed with AIDS. And he was in such shock and rage about this that the piece grew out of that emotion. And the piece is dedicated to Shelley. And actually, the most poignant thing, I was in the first performance. I played the piano part in Chicago. And Shelley miraculously survived to attend that first performance. So he was at a piece that was really written as an intended piece in memory of him, and he was still alive for a few weeks after the premiere. And of course, he was desperately ill, but he made it. He was there. He looked wonderful in a white suit. I can remember seeing him now, the most gentle, humorous, wonderful man. And he was there. And yeah, as you say, not a dry eye in the house. It was an incredibly powerful thing. I can't imagine this plague or this virus having quite the same emotional impact on creativity as that did. Except this idea of isolation, that people are shut away. And maybe in some people that will produce a different effect. I think particularly people who live alone. If you have a partner, if you have family living with you, it's very different being isolated in your apartment than it is if you're totally alone.
Mm-hmm.
Some people, like pianists, spend most of their lives alone. So maybe it's easier for that than it is for someone whose working environment is in a big office with a lot of people around all the time. And then they're at home. What do they do? So I think it will depend. For me, it's just, I can't see it influencing what I'm writing particularly. It's just giving me the opportunity to concentrate. So that's its only influence on me so far. But of course, we wake up every day and we have different reactions to things. So who knows?
So back to the book. How did the book come about? It seems to me like it's a miscellany of all these pieces, some of which you've written for magazines, some of which are probably on the back of matchbooks or in notebooks. There's a lot about the nature of the piano, construction of piano, pianism, pedaling. You know, there's like sort of instruction for pianists and pianists to be. But it's also a lot of ruminations about what it means to be an artist and what it means to be a professional artist. And one of the questions which I had for you, which I think your book answered, is whenever I think about concert performers, I think, how do you memorize so much? You know, how do you deal with your nerves? And one thing that comes across in your writing is this incredible amount of faith that you have. And that the way that you express your faith is often through concentration and meditation. And that the nature of work, you say, is as much as about meditation as focus, is just like sitting and pounding the keys. That it seems to me that that faith gives you a focus to almost everything that you do. Would that be correct?
On a good day. It certainly doesn't always work, you know, and it's a work in progress. But yeah, I think you have to learn to use your time wisely and to concentrate, because you very often when you're traveling around, you have a certain segment of the day when you have to do the practice. And, you know, it's funny because you're on stage, your imagination to run riot and wild and create something, you know, that's full of fantasy and imagination. And that's great. But when you're off the stage, you have to catch a flight at a very specific time. And then you have to become very pragmatic, very organized. And it's this weird split thing between the offstage organization and the onstage fantasy.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the challenges, I think, that sometimes really wonderful artists, people that I've worked, haven't quite been able to get that balance right. They either have all this imagination, but they're hopeless and they have no sense of organization, or they can never get something ready on time. Or there are those who are all about getting things ready on time, but then when they've got them ready, there's nothing really to say. So you have that balance always, and that's what the challenge is. It's a very schizophrenic kind of life.
What do you think about your growing up and the teachers that you've had gave you the opportunity to have the concert career and to be called one of the Living Polymaths, which is by the Economist, which is an incredible title, by the way, to hold on your head, even more than the Mayor's Chains of London. I think it's a very heavy title to carry. But you know, there are a lot of very talented musicians who don't come to your point in life. Do you ever think about how you got there?
I try not to think too much about those things. No, I was rather bemused. A friend of mine sent me this link to the Economist thing about the 20 living polymaths, and I thought, oh gosh, what's a polymath? That sounds fun. No, but no, it's part of people have to have a tag for something, and I think I enjoy doing lots of different things. And you mentioned before, the book and how it came about, and I've always loved words, and I've always jotted down ideas, and I've always written poetry. I've got books of it from when I was in my teens. I daren't look at it. All of us have cupboards full of things that we don't want to see, But it was always there, this desire to express myself, and even to express things in music. I would feel these emotions, and yes, the music, of course, describes that, but I wanted to get a word to hang those emotions on. And so over the years, I've written stuff, I've jotted down things myself, and then the bulk of this book, the backbone of it really, was the blog that I kept for the Telegraph. Someone I knew there said, would you like to write a blog for us? This was about 2009. Mm-hmm. And I said, well, that sounds fun. I said, I can probably only write about 10 things though, and I wouldn't want to write only about music, and I write about other things as well. So he said, fine. And then I found it just kept going, and I'd written over 600 different articles for this. And then they took the blog down. The newspaper had a restructuring, and they just deleted everything. I'd kept most of it in my own private notebooks. And so I thought, well, there's a lot of material here that I'd like to revisit, to rework. And so I started, gathering it together, and a lot of it was of no interest at all. And I repeated myself, so I compressed those chapters together. And then I found that I'd got this big collection of things, and I showed it initially to Faber Books in London. And they just said, yeah, we'd love to publish this. And then Jonathan Galassi at FSG saw it too, and he said, yeah, I'd love to be a part of this too. So the two of them, we got together, and we cut away probably about a third of it, and we're left with 450 pages of odd ends of notes. Yeah, there's a lot about music in there. A lot of it's very practical. How do you practice? How do you trill? What is it like to make a recording? What is it like to be backstage in a concert hall? So there's a lot of sort of behind the scenes stuff. But then there are thoughts about writers that I've read, ideas, some visual art things. There's a little chapter about religious issues, although none of it too heavy-handed, I hope, because one of my greatest fears is the sort of religious person who's so sure of things that they have this kind of confidence. I'm not sure of any of it at all, and I'm questioning all the time. But that process of questioning, I find that it is an important anchor for me, that there's something beyond me. I think that's really what it is if I'm the center of the universe, it's a very small universe. And so the fact that
from reading the book that your teachers gave you that, I mean, I see you had wonderful teachers. I mean, from Gordon Green,
Gordon was a very special teacher in that a line that I don't quote in the book, but a line that one of his other students said to me recently, and I loved it. It was one of his students that was from China, actually, and she was graduating, and he was very fond of her, and he said, now, I want you to go home and forget everything I told you. And that's very Gordon Green. He was he was interested in what you had to say, not in being groomed by him. So you wouldn't go into a lesson, he'd say, now you do this, you do that. He listened to you, and he worked with what he heard. So if someone was quite shy in the way they played, then he'd work with that. He wouldn't try and make you into a brazen kind of player. If someone was very passionate and powerful, great, he'd work with that. And that's what I really treasure with him. He was about the long picture as well. He said to me once, I was asking, could I enter some competitions? I was about 15. He said, no. He said, I'm interested in how you're going to play in 10 years' time, not in how you're going to play next week. Give it time, make mistakes, try things out, take time off, experiment. And that whole way of thinking, the long journey, I've found so valuable, because it is a long journey as a pianist, and you don't want to use up all of your gunpowder in the first years.
So you went from, you grew up in
Cheshire,
and then you went to the Royal College of Music in
Manchester.
Manchester. And so did you get your undergraduate degree in conservatory there?
That's right.
And
then I went to
then you got
Juilliard.
to Juilliard
Yeah,
after?
and I did a master's at Juilliard.
So what was that like? Because I heard it's a cauldron.
It's great now, and I don't say that just because I'm on the faculty now, but the difference is really extraordinary. When I was there, teachers wouldn't talk to each other. A student couldn't go and talk to another teacher. But now it's encouraged to play for different teachers on the faculty. And in fact, both my students there, I share with other teachers, and I love that because in the tradition of Gordon Green, there's no one answer to any of these things. And I think to get as many different opinions about things as possible, especially at graduate level. I think, when you're an undergraduate, you need a certain amount of discipline. But once you get to 21, you need to expand and get ideas. And, again, Gordon Green, he was very happy when students decided they wanted to leave him. Now, most teachers don't feel like that. They feel, what have I done wrong? Or he would say, I've taught you what I have to say. Go to someone else. You'll get other ideas. And there's a little bit of that at Juilliard now, and I really treasure that. It's a joy to be there.
That's wonderful. And then you really touched the lives of many of the great pianists directly or indirectly, from Vladimir Horowitz to Arthur Schnabel to Adele Marcus. I mean, there's a real great tradition of pedagogy in the piano.
There is, yeah. And, many of these people became real mentors to their students. And, that's what I would hope with my own students. I mean, I offer ideas and so on, but if someone leaves a lesson of mine feeling encouraged to work hard, to do better, but not to be overstressed, then I feel that I'm doing a good job. Because the talented students will make it. Mm-hmm. They just need guidance. You don't need to tell them every single thing. It's like your child. If you've got a child, you want them to flourish on their own. And they'll do things you don't like necessarily, but that's great because that means they're living an independent life. And I feel very much the same with my students.
So do you want to give us a taste of the book? Do you want to read one of the passages which you've prepared for us?
Well, I haven't prepared so well. I've put a marker in the page.
That's as much preparation as we need, Stephen.
That's probably as much as you need, isn't it? Let's see. Well, this is one about Debussy and Ravel, the two French composers. So here we go. Debussy and Ravel, chalk and cheese. It is sometimes said, oh, that pianist is wonderful in Debussy and Ravel. This is strange. Not that someone can't play both composers beautifully, but that it's presumed there's a necessary connection between the sensibility or skills required. Yes, they were both French, lived at the same time, shared the same publisher, Durand, and wrote music that could be termed impressionist. But in soul, and thus in interpretation, the two composers are completely different animals. Leaving aside detailed musical comparisons, let's just look through the keyhole into their bathrooms and bedrooms to glimpse some clues. Ravel's keen razor, shaving clean the lines of his thin face. Debussy's wayward beard, carelessly trimmed, hiding loose folds of flesh underneath. The sharp parting of Ravel's hair versus Debussy's bush ruffled out of sleep. Ravel's tie selected, then knotted with a keen eye, versus Debussy's cravat twisted around a day-old shirt. Both men smoked cigarettes, but whereas I can almost smell the nicotine fingers of Debussy in the photographs, I imagine Ravel's gitan to be masked by a rose-scented pomade, and with not a speck of ash outside the ashtray. And sex, Debussy's tumbling, voluptuous celebration of it, Ravel's repressed desire suffocating inside his immaculately tailored suits, his fastidiousness repelling intimacy, the love that dare not tweak his mane. Ravel has been described as a Swiss watchmaker for his precision and the clear intent of every dot, every line, every slur, whereas Debussy could never be mistaken as a timekeeper. Many of his pieces could lose their bar lines or time signatures without losing their way. You always see the individual drops of rain in Ravel's mists, whereas Debussy invites us to look at the garden beyond, a blur through the moisture. Pigeonholes are to be avoided in music, and to presume that a pianist will be equally at home in these two very different composers is dangerous. They are two French birds that simply do not sing on the same branch.
It's lovely. Thank you. Having said that, this is the 250th anniversary of Beethoven.
Indeed.
So how would he feel knowing that all of these tributes to him will have been canceled because of the pandemic?
Well, you know, I don't feel so sorry for Beethoven. He's not going anywhere. I tell you, I feel very sorry, though, for many composers and playwrights, for that matter, who've had performances scheduled of their new works, worked on them for years, workshopped them, rehearsed them, got funding for them and all of this, and then just cancelled. In fact, I was drinking from this mug, The Inheritance, the wonderful play, which opened on Broadway a few months ago, I presume, of course, now.
Matthew Lopez.
Please go to it when it opens up again. It's a wonderful play. I never buy mugs for plays that I go and see. But I think it's interesting that Beethoven had overexposure. There's so many concerts with the complete this and the complete that. And now we can play Beethoven next year and the year after all over again. So
that's true.
But there's a serious point, Cheryl, to this, because Beethoven is a composer of isolation in some ways. Because he, when he was deaf, was isolated from the world. I mean, here's someone for whom sound was everything. And he's closed up, unable to hear the music that he's written. And also this, you know, we see this in some of the later letters that he wrote, this feeling of isolation. He never had a significant relationship with a woman in his life. He was possibly even a virgin. We don't know, but it's not impossible. He was very, people ran away from him because they thought he was like a bagman. You know, he was once arrested for vagrancy because they thought he was a homeless person who didn't have anywhere to live. So he had this sense of isolation very often. And, you know, underneath that is this heart of such tenderness. We think of Beethoven as a very virile kind of composer, a very triumphant, but he was also a man of tremendous gentleness and delicacy and tenderness. And I think he would have responded, he would have had great sympathy for all of us locked away, I think, at this time. And then again, there's no composer for me who's better represented of someone overcoming adversity. Totally. You know, who else could you have played when the Berlin Wall came down? There's no one but Beethoven. There are many other positive composers and great composers, of course, but Bach, I think, would have seemed too perfect, specific. Beethoven is the one, you know, Beethoven's the one with a mess in his life that overcomes that mess with deep personal difficulties. He was sick with many things, not just with his deafness. He had digestive problems, he had skin problems, you know, he had jaundice, all sorts of medical issues, but somehow no self-pity. He overcame that with his music. And I think that's why Beethoven is the perfect person for these times.
I was very struck. You talked a little bit about Adele Herz-Sommer, the Holocaust survivor, who, when asked, she said her religion is Jewish. I mean, that she's Jewish, but her religion is Beethoven.
Right.
She lived to 102. And I was thinking of also that who else would you play but Beethoven, and who else would you have it conducted but Bernstein at the Berlin Wall when the Berlin Wall came down. And while I was researching this before I spoke to you, supposedly I thought, who was the orchestra that played under Bernstein? And it turns out it was the Bavaria Radio Symphony, but also musicians from all over the world came to celebrate that. And to me, music has always represented sort of the heights of civilization. You know, even if it's just the three tenors, singing at the Baths of Caracalla at the World Cup, there's always this place in classical music for great events. And I remember 9/11 in New York, there was an organization started that my choir was involved in, that every year on 9/11 that they would bring music all over the world to bring hope.
Right.
So I think that that will probably come also. And I wanted to ask you, having mentioned that a lot of these young playwrights, young composers won't have their works performed because of the lockdown. what do you see the world of classical music looking like when we come out of it? It was basically hanging by a thread in those places other than Germany that aren't state supported. So, you know, there was a very interesting op-ed by Peter Gelb. You know, in some ways, they're streaming music, they're streaming operas from the Met to people who could never afford a seat. So maybe it's opening up new audiences, but what's going to happen to the professional classical musicians?
Well, I think a lot of it depends on how long this all goes on, doesn't it? Because actually, I think if it goes on for months and months, there will be serious implications for the finances of orchestras and various other. I mean, the big, you know, New York Philharmonic is not going anywhere, but there are orchestras in smaller towns where they rely entirely on the support of someone in the States, I'm thinking, whose whole business has gone, that, you know, that's not going to continue. I hope, though, that the streaming is fantastic. And I mean, the fact we can watch operas at home like this is great. But I do hope it will give us a thirst for the real thing again, for real concerts, for the fact that concerts are not just about listening to music, they're about listening to music with other people around. And just as when you go to a museum, I like to go with someone else. I also like to go alone, but it's wonderful. Or going to a movie, you leave the movie and you talk about it. And somehow it's great, isn't it, to have a meal after a movie and discuss whether you liked it or not and what did they mean by that, or after a play, or even when you've read a book. If someone else has read the same book, you want to talk about it. And so I think that community is terribly important, actually, for our music. The music that we hear was written as communication to live people. Beethoven wrote this music to be heard by people, not for him to hear just in his head at home. And so I think this is what perhaps will happen is it will be a two-tiered thing. We'll have more streaming, but we'll also, I hope, have more audiences coming. And maybe we have to look at the financial side of this. Maybe we have to make tickets cheaper. Mm-hmm. Maybe we take pay cuts, all of us, you know, to make that happen. There are all sorts of issues that will be re-examined. I see just on the news, I don't know whether you saw this, that Milan has already completely restructuring its city. They're widening the sidewalks, they're lowering the speed limit, because they realize how wonderful this has been for the environment, this lack of pollution. And that when they come back out of this, it's going to be a very different city. And I think maybe the whole world can take a lesson from that, and maybe we do have to re-examine exactly what we do with our cities and with our travel.
Do you think that classical music needs to appeal to younger people, and that one of the ways of doing that is by lowering the cost of tickets?
I think that's a big issue. I don't think young people, especially talking as a middle-aged person, if I come and say, well, I think young people want this, if I know young people, that's the exact thing they don't want once I've said that as a middle-aged person. Mm-hmm. I don't think that making things easy and accessible is necessarily going to make people want to do it. People pay a lot of money for sports events, young people, a lot of money for pop concerts, rock concerts. I think we have to keep the level of quality high, and we have to tell people, you know, this music is not easy to listen to. A Mahler symphony needs a little preparation. It needs an hour sometimes to sit in your seat. You have to concentrate. Are you up for this, young person? Mm-hmm. Can you really cope with this? Rather than say, hey, it's quite easy, and we'll just play you 10 minutes of it, and it won't be too difficult. I think there may be a piece actually in the book about this. I remember when I was at school, I remember saying to my English teacher, what's the hardest book to read? And he said, oh, Finnegan's Wake by James Joyce. I ran to the library to get that book. I wanted to try and read that book. I didn't want to read Agatha Christie then. Mm-hmm. I do now. But, I think young people can be challenged by difficult things in a way that we shouldn't be saying, well, oh dear, we have no young people. How can we make it easy so they can come? I don't think that's going to get people in. And on the other side of this, and there's another essay in the book about this, I love my old audiences. I love people with grey hair in the audience. And I think it's a really terrible thing to make old people feel that they're second best. Because sometimes, when you get older in your life, you have more time. Maybe you're retired, you can go to concerts, you have a bit of money left aside, you can pay for tickets. Let's encourage our old people too. We want everyone there. Classical music Beethoven's 250 years old, you know? I mean, it's old stuff. There's no one alive who knew him, so that you can't be too old for Beethoven.
Before we turn it over to John to see if there's any questions in the universe for you, were your parents musicians? Were you raised in a musical household?
Nothing at all. We had no classical records in the house at all when I started to play the piano. So
what drew you to it?
I had an aunt who had a piano, and we'd visit her, and I was fascinated by this box in the corner. I'd go over and I'd play nursery rhymes on it. I was aged about 4 or 5, and I said to my parents, please, can I have piano lessons? And in the end, they agreed, and they bought me a piano, and that's how it started. Now, my father became very interested and very knowledgeable about it. Now, I didn't have a musical background at all, which is maybe comforting, because people feel that you have to have that in the family and be able to do it.
So when you were asking your English teacher, can you read Finnegan's Wake, what were you asking Gordon Green to play that he thought was way beyond you?
Well, you know, in those years, I wish Gordon Green was still alive, because I wasted a lot of my time with him. Because those were the years when I was watching 6 hours of soap operas a day and practicing very little. I had a real dip in my early mid-teens. I didn't want to do anything. I was burning joss sticks in my bedroom and listening to Emerson, Lake and Palmer and Led Zeppelin, practicing the minimum I could. My hair was down to my shoulders. My jeans were great big bell-bottom flares. I was a real kind of teenage hippie at the time. So no, the music was not doing it for me then, which again is why I don't feel we should be so worried if young people are not interested. They'll come to it later. Just leave the door open and don't make them feel like they should or like they're second best or anything. Just, it's there, you know, give every point of access we can and then let it happen.
Okay, John, do we have any questions that we want to ask Stephen?
I do. I have 3 from the crowd. The first one is, hi, Stephen. When you get really mad or stressed, is there any specific music you play?
Silence. I tend to get stressed with music, and that's when I'm practicing at home. So, you know, a whole day at the piano, trying to play better all the time, falling down all the time. You know, practicing is like trying to hang a painting on a wall and the nail keeps falling out. And you knock it in again and it falls out, and again and again and again. At the end of the day, the last thing I want is to listen to music. So I close the piano, I leave, I go to a movie, I go to the theater, whatever, but not more music.
And I had a question emailed from Andrew earlier in the day. Did you have to think back in order to create this book, or did you have notes taken over the years of your life to fall back on?
Yeah, lots of notes. There's probably nothing in here. I think the oldest thing would be an article I wrote about Chopin, maybe in the late 90s. That would be the oldest thing. Most of it is recent, and some of it was completely original to the book. It's not all rehashed. And I don't think there's one paragraph that hasn't been changed in the entire book from what it originally was. So it was very much reconceived, because, you know, the blogs, I wrote them in the morning and posted them, and then they were up, you know, I had no time to edit them or to rethink them. So, yeah, it's sort of a combination of that.
Another person emailed to ask, in your book, you distinguish Debussy from Ravel physically and a little bit musically. Could you please ask Stephen to offer one piece by Debussy or by Ravel where the contrast is apparent to a non-professional musician such as myself?
How interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, now I'm being
Tested.
Okay, well, let's take 2 water pieces. Let's take Reflet dans l'eau of Debussy and Ondine of Ravel. I think if you listen to those 2, you also get the repressed sexuality in Ondine of Ravel, because it's got this climax of a kind of voluptuous nature, but it's so beautifully refined, and he's taken care of every, and this is one for Cheryl, every demi-semi-quaver.
Exactly.
That page we were talking about the strange English terms for these notes. So I would say that would be a good piece to demonstrate some of those issues. And Reflet dans l'eau is obviously Reflections in the Water. And I think you get something of where Debussy's bar lines have gone away. You don't really sense where the bars are. So give those a try.
And when I was reading your piece, I was thinking that the pièce de résistance of sexual repression is bolero.
Exactly. Wow. Although when you see some of the choreography for that, there's not much repressed anymore, but still.
Exactly, but there's no climax. It's just going to climax and nothing. That's Ravel.
I've got another question from the crowd. Are there any brilliant musicians that you know who simply cannot memorize the music? I have a weird deficit that prevents me from learning by rote more than a few bars of anything, so I am fascinated by memorization. How do you think of it?
I can't think of a particular person. I mean, there are people now who play by choice from the score, but that doesn't mean they can't memorize. It just means they're more comfortable. In defense of memorizing, again, there are 2 chapters on this in the book about whether we should memorize and whether it matters. I would say that in the stage of learning, it's a very different psychology to have memorized a piece than just use the score. And there are certain pieces where I would feel very strange playing them from the score. I take a piece like the Liszt Sonata. For me, that's a piece of drama that's very much like an actor walking out onto the stage. And just like I can't imagine someone playing Hamlet with a script in one hand, it just, somehow the very energy of the piece suggests for me as if it should look like you're making it up as you're playing it. And you can't do that if you're looking up and down the music. Whereas Bach, I see no reason for memorizing Bach except as a stunt. And I admire hugely people who do it. And there are people like Andras Schiff or many people who have played everything by Bach from memory. And I mean, I'm staggered by that level of retention. But I don't think it's necessary to the music. And in fact, in some sort of weird way, I think it looks better when someone's playing Bach from the score, because it's a little bit like, and again, I speak about this, it's a bit like a priest or a rabbi actually holding the sacred text in the hand, even if they know it, somehow you're reading it. Reading is part of the reverence for the text. And I think that comes out in Bach for me.
One of the pieces in the book that I thought showed your incredible versatility across genres was the piece you wrote for a CD about Chopin, the bowler, and Mark Rothko. It's sort of like, how do you put these 3 things together and write something about them all?
Well, I tell you, that was
really
gorgeous. And the reason I wrote that piece was I had the photograph, which is actually the cover of, I don't have it here, but the cover of this book in the English version, which is me standing in a bowler hat in front of a Mark Rothko painting in Chicago. It's the great orange and yellow one there in the Art Institute. And I liked this photograph, and I suggested to the record company that it would make a great cover. And he said, but that's crazy. What's it got to do with Chopin? So it was a challenge to me. So I thought, okay, I'm going to write an essay that proves that Mark Rothko, the bowler hat, and Chopin were related. So that was
very well done.
Piece, but.
And before we leave, just talk a little bit about Liszt, because I've never heard anybody write about Liszt with that amount of affection and knowledge. Most people write about Liszt with the incredible difficulty of his pieces, but he basically transformed modern music. I mean, we memorize because of Liszt.
Nothing that we do as musicians. I mean, certainly this instrument behind me, it's turned off. It's an electric one. Without Liszt. Liszt invented the piano recital. He was the person pretty much to conduct other people's music. Until Liszt, there was a composer. A composer would come in and would conduct to make a piece of hers or his work. Harmonically, he really invented 3 separate strands which became 20th century music. The Impressionist, in those late works of his, the Primitivist, which became Bartók and Kodály, and actually in a certain sense Stravinsky, and the Wagnerian. He was there with Wagnerian harmony before Wagner. He was also Wagner's father-in-law, of course, which is a whole other story. But yeah, Liszt began his life by being the most phenomenal pianist that anyone had ever seen. He was the Paganini of the piano. But he gave all of that up in his mid-30s, and he concentrated on composition, on teaching, and on promoting other people's music. He was an incredibly generous man in that regard. Without him, Berlioz, Schumann, Wagner, so many others would not have had the exposure that they did. He was completely selfless in that. The critics hated this music that, when he conducted a piece of Wagner or a piece of Berlioz, and he kept on doing it. So we have gratitude to Liszt for so much. And yeah, he was by all accounts, a really wonderful, generous man. Someone told me a wonderful story just recently, and it's kind of related to the present time in some ways, but he was giving a recital, and I can't remember. Oh yes, they'd forgotten to put up any posters. So he arrived at the venue, and there were about 6 people, maybe 10 people sitting there in this big hall. And he said, well, this doesn't make any sense, does it? Why don't you all come back to my hotel room? I'll play you the recital there, and we'll have some champagne as well. I just thought, well, that's really a wonderful, wonderful story. There's one other one that's even more touching about Liszt. This woman had put on her poster for her recitals, student of Liszt. She'd never met Liszt. And all over the town, student of Liszt, whatever her name was, student of Liszt. And she then found out that Liszt was in town that day. I mean, of all the bad luck. And she was absolutely mortified. She was trembling. She was having a nervous breakdown. And she decided to go to Liszt at his hotel and beg his forgiveness. So she did, and she went in, and he smiled, and he said, well, what are you playing in this concert tonight? And she gave a list of pieces, and he said, well, play one of them for me. And so she played a Chopin waltz or something, and he gave her a few points. He said, now you can say you're a student of Liszt.
That's wonderful.
It gives you a real insight into the warmth that he had in his heart.
That's lovely. Okay, so John, what do you think?
I think maybe we have time for one last question. I don't want to keep you too much longer because I know it's late where you are. Sort of related to the question about what music you play when you're stressed or mad. You said that you didn't listen to any, you would go to a play or a movie. Somebody asked, what's inspiring you these days during this difficult period where you can't go to see a play or see a movie?
Mm-hmm.
I'm watching Damages with Glenn Close.
Yeah. That's great.
I'm serious. This is the time, of course, for binge watching. The Crown, I highly recommend The Crown. What else? I'm watching movies I've never seen. I saw Gone with Them for the first time during
Which
the
movie?
lockdown. Gone with the Wind.
Gone with the Wind.
Never seen
Great
it.
movie.
I saw what was Dr. Zhivago. Never seen Dr. Zhivago.
Amazing.
So there's huge gaps in my life that I'm plugging during this time.
All right. So I think, what do you say, John?
We're punched down.
I think.
Yeah, I think so.
Well, thank you so much, Stephen, for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again in New York on the other side.
Thank you, Stephen. We'll do it again in person, and hopefully we'll sell a bunch of your books, and we'll hear you play as well.
Oh, thank you, Sharon. See you all in New York. I miss the city so much. So take care and be well.
Okay, and stay safe in London.
Thank you. You too. Okay, bye.
Thank you,
Bye.
everybody.
Bye.
Bye.